For 100 years, Germany built the finest engineering on earth. Japan mastered efficiency. America invented the modern car industry. Then, in roughly 36 months, a company most Westerners couldn't name in 2019 turned all of it into rubble. Volkswagen cut 50,000 jobs. Porsche lost 92% of its profits. Stellantis posted a $26 billion loss that's more than the entire GDP of Iceland. You heard that right, more than a whole country produces in a year, wiped out. But here's what the headlines won't tell you. This wasn't just disruption, it was demolition. Planned, funded, and executed with a precision that no free market could have produced. And the most chilling part? The blueprint was published in plain sight. Before you can understand how deep this goes, you need to see what BYD actually built, because the innovations were real, and that's exactly what makes everything else so much darker. The bloodbath is real. Picture the boardrooms of Stuttgart, Tokyo, and Detroit in 2020. Executives were still debating when to take electric vehicles seriously. They had decades of brand equity, billions in infrastructure, and the most loyal customer bases in the world. They weren't worried. They probably should have been. Because while they were holding meetings about meetings, BYD was moving, and by the time the numbers started coming in, the damage was already done. Let's start with Volkswagen, the company that once symbolized Germany's industrial soul. In 2024, Volkswagen announced it would be closing 3 factories inside Germany itself. Not restructuring, not relocating, closing. Then came the job. Cuts 50,000 positions, gone. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the entire population of a mid-sized American city losing their livelihood because a Chinese automaker they barely took seriously 5 years ago had eaten their lunch. But the factory closures weren't even the worst part. The worst part was what it said about the future, that Volkswagen's leadership had looked at the numbers and concluded that shrinking was the only way to survive. But this was just the beginning of the bloodbath. Porsche, the brand that made the 911, the car that wealthy Europeans buy to tell the world they've made it, lost 92% of its profits. Not a dip, not a rough quarter. 92%. The kind of number that makes investors go quiet in rooms. Porsche had spent decades building a reputation so strong it felt untouchable. Then the Chinese market, which had become one of its most critical revenue sources, started choosing BYD's premium offerings instead. And Porsche had no answer. Then came Stellantis. If you're not familiar with the name, Stellantis is the parent company behind Jeep, Dodge, Ram, Chrysler, Peugeot, and a dozen other brands you've definitely heard of. In 2024, Stellantis posted a $26 billion loss. $26 billion. That's more than the GDP of Iceland, more than an entire nation produces in a year, evaporated in a single financial report. You heard that right. One bad year, driven largely by an inability to compete with Chinese pricing, cost Stellantis more than most countries are worth. Their CEO was pushed out, plants were idled. Brands that had survived recessions, oil crises, and 2 world wars were suddenly looking fragile. And it wasn't just these 3 that were falling apart. Mercedes watched its sales crater 28%. BMW started issuing profit warnings. Ford hemorrhaged billions on its EV transition while simultaneously failing to compete on price. General Motors quietly scaled back EV targets it had announced with great fanfare just years earlier. Across the board, the Western auto industry, an industry that had dominated global markets for a century, was bleeding from every direction at once. Now here's what makes this so hard to process. This wasn't like when Japanese automakers disrupted Detroit in the 70s with better fuel efficiency. That was a market shift. Consumers wanted something different, and Japanese companies delivered it. What happened with BYD feels different because on the surface, the story looks the same. A scrappy underdog, better technology, smarter strategy, and a Western industry too arrogant to adapt in time. But the numbers don't add up for a free market story, not even close. Think about it this way. When a new entrant disrupts an industry, they typically do it by finding a gap, undercutting on price, and slowly building market share while managing thin margins. It's a grind. It takes decades. Yet BYD scaled from a regional player to the world's largest EV seller in a time frame that defies every conventional model of how industries change. The speed alone should have raised red flags. And for some analysts, it did. Because behind the gleaming factories, the record sales figures, and the genuinely impressive engineering, there was a financial architecture that most people never looked at closely. And when you do look at it closely, the picture that emerges isn't a startup success story. It looks like something else entirely. But before you can understand the machinery behind BYD's rise, you need to see what they actually built, because the innovations were real, and without them, none of what comes next would have worked. The innovations were real. Before you write BYD off as a pure government project, you need to sit with something uncomfortable. They actually built things that were genuinely brilliant. Not good enough brilliant. World-class brilliant, the kind of innovations that would have turned heads even without a single dollar of state support. And if you don't understand what they built, you'll never understand how the deception worked. Start with vertical integration. When most automakers build a car, they're essentially assembling parts made by hundreds of different suppliers. Chips come from one company, batteries from another, motors from somewhere else. That's how the entire industry was structured, and for decades, it worked fine. BYD looked at that model and decided it was a weakness, so they eliminated it. Today, BYD makes their own chips, their own batteries, their own electric motors, their own steel, and in some facilities, even their own glass. They are, in the most literal sense, a company that builds almost everything that goes into their vehicles themselves. What that means in practice is brutal competitive advantage. When the global chip shortage hit in 2021, and Western automakers were shutting down production lines because they couldn't source semiconductors, BYD barely flinched. While Ford and GM were losing billions in lost production, BYD kept building. That single moment told you everything about how differently this company was structured and how exposed their competitors actually were. But this was just one piece of what they got right. The second innovation was the plug-in hybrid bet, and this one takes a minute to appreciate fully. The Western auto industry made a collective decision to go all in on pure battery electric vehicles. The logic made sense in boardrooms and policy documents: zero emissions, simpler drivetrains, the future. But there was a problem nobody wanted to say out loud. Outside of major cities, charging infrastructure was a disaster. In rural China, in Southeast Asia, in markets across the developing world, you couldn't bet your transportation on finding a charger. Pure EVs were a product built for a world that didn't fully exist yet. BYD saw this clearly. While Western brands were racing toward a pure EV future, BYD doubled down on plug-in hybrids vehicles that could run on electric power for daily commutes, but switch to a combustion engine when needed. It sounds like a compromise. It wasn't. It was the right product for the right market at the right time. In 2024, BYD's plug-in hybrid models outsold their pure EVs in several key markets. The customers weren't choosing the future, they were choosing what actually worked for their lives, and BYD was the one handing it to them. Then came the most important innovation of all: the Blade battery. If you follow the EV industry even casually, you've heard about battery fires, the nightmare scenario where a lithium-ion pack ignites and burns so hot that conventional fire suppression can't stop it. It was one of the biggest consumer trust barriers facing EV adoption globally. BYD's engineers went after this problem directly and came back with something remarkable. The Blade battery uses a lithium iron phosphate chemistry arranged in a long, flat cell structure that is dramatically more stable than conventional battery packs. It's harder to puncture, harder to overheat, and when it does fail, it fails slowly rather than catastrophically. It was also cheaper to produce at scale, and safer meant less shielding required, which meant lighter, which meant more efficient. Every advantage was compounded. Here's how you know it was genuinely world-class. Tesla bought it. The same Tesla that had spent years developing its own proprietary battery technology. The same Elon Musk who built a brand identity around being the most advanced EV company on Earth, turned around and signed a supply deal for BYD's Blade battery. When your fiercest competitor buys your component, The debate about whether your technology is real is over. These three things, vertical integration, the PHEV bet, and the blade battery, gave BYD a foundation that was genuinely formidable. In a fair fight, they might have still won. But the fight was never fair. And when you see the numbers behind how BYD was actually funded, you'll understand why what looked like a market victory was something far more calculated and far more troubling. Beijing's hidden war machine. Here's the question nobody in the Western auto industry wanted to ask out loud. How does a company scale this fast, this aggressively, while selling cars at prices that their competitors mathematically cannot match? The answer, when you actually dig into it, isn't a story about efficiency or genius alone. It's a story about money. Enormous, systematic, state-directed money. Let's start with the number that reframes everything you just heard in the last chapter. Between 2015 and 2020, BYD received $4.3 billion in direct government subsidies, not tax incentives, not grants applied for through some bureaucratic process. Direct subsidies, handed over by Beijing as part of a coordinated industrial strategy. $4.3 billion over 5 years, flowing into a company that the Chinese government had decided needed to win, not compete, win. But the number that truly exposes what was happening came in 2016. That year, BYD's government subsidies exceeded the company's entire net profit. You heard that right. If you removed Beijing's money from the equation, BYD wasn't breaking even. They were losing money. The company that was about to reshape the global auto industry was, by any honest accounting, unprofitable without state support. Every car they sold at a price Western manufacturers couldn't match was being sold at a loss that Chinese taxpayers were quietly absorbing. And this was just the beginning of what Beijing put on the table. Beyond the direct subsidies, BYD received free land for factory construction in a country where land is state-owned. That gift is essentially unlimited. They received zero-interest loans from state-backed banks, the kind of financing that no private company operating in a free market could ever access. And then there were the consumer-facing subsidies, up to $4,000 per vehicle, handed directly to Chinese buyers who purchased a BYD. Think about what that does to a price comparison. A Western automaker building a car with market-rate financing, paying real land costs, and selling at a price that needs to generate actual profit is competing against a BYD that has had its factory built for free, financed at 0% interest, and is offering its customers a $4,000 discount that Beijing is covering. That isn't competition. That is a controlled demolition of an industry, dressed up to look like a market outcome. But here's what makes this darker than a simple subsidy story. This wasn't improvised. It wasn't a government reacting to market conditions and throwing money at a promising company. It was a published strategy. Made in China 2025, announced in 2015, explicitly named the industries China intended to dominate globally, and electric vehicles were at the top of the list. The targets were specific. The funding mechanisms were coordinated across multiple ministries. The timeline was deliberate. Western governments read this document. Western automakers knew it existed. And almost none of them responded with anything close to the urgency the moment demanded. Beijing wasn't hiding the playbook. They handed it to the world and watched the world shrug. Then came the most calculated part of the entire operation, the global pricing strategy. As BYD expanded into international markets, they priced their vehicles at levels that forced a choice on every competitor. Match the price and lose money. Don't match it and lose market share. There was no third option. Western manufacturers weren't losing because they built worse products. Some of their engineering was still world-class. They were losing because they were playing a game with different financial rules, and nobody had told their customers that the other team was being bankrolled by a government with a 20-year plan. For a moment, it looked unstoppable. BYD's sales numbers were climbing. The Western industry was reeling. Beijing's strategy appeared to be working exactly as designed. But then, the cracks started appearing. Quietly at first in financial filings, in supplier relationships, in quality reports that weren't getting much attention. Then, louder. And when analysts started looking at BYD's actual financial structure with fresh eyes, what they found wasn't the balance sheet of a conquering champion. It looked a lot more like a house of cards. The cracks appear. For a while, the narrative held perfectly. BYD was the unstoppable force. The sales records kept breaking. The factory expansions kept coming. The Western media kept writing the underdog story. And then, sometime around late 2024, a handful of analysts started asking a question that should have been asked much earlier if BYD is winning this decisively. Why don't the financials look like a winner? What they found when they started digging should have made global headlines. It didn't, but it will. GMT Research, one of the most respected independent financial analysis firms covering Asian markets, published an estimate that stopped people cold. BYD's real debt, when you account for the financial obligations that aren't cleanly reported on their official balance sheet, sits at approximately $323 billion. $323 billion, you heard that right. That is nearly 8 times what BYD officially reports as its debt load. To put that in a frame, you can feel that number is larger than the entire annual GDP of many mid-sized nations. It is a debt burden so large that if it were sitting transparently on their books, BYD's financial story would look completely unrecognizable from the one being told in press releases. But this was just the beginning of what the numbers were hiding. The mechanism concealing this debt is something called supplier payment delays, and it's as simple and as ruthless as it sounds. Instead of paying the companies that supply BYD with components on normal commercial terms, BYD was stretching those payments out, not by days, not by weeks, by an average of 275 days. That's over 9 months. Think about what that means for a supplier. You've delivered your parts, you've covered your labor costs, you've kept your factory running, and you are waiting 9 months to get paid. BYD is essentially using its suppliers as an involuntary credit line, borrowing from them without calling it borrowing, keeping the obligation off its formal debt disclosures, and presenting a balance sheet to the world that doesn't reflect the true weight it's carrying. Then came the most devastating revelation of all. The zero-kilometer used car scandal. In China, a vehicle that has been registered but never actually purchased by a real customer gets classified in the used car market as a zero-kilometer used car. It carries a registration date but no real owner, and in 2025, the Chinese used car market was flooded with them, and a disproportionate number were BYDs. What this implied about BYD's reported sales figures was staggering. If a significant portion of the 4.25 million vehicles BYD claimed to have sold in 2025 were never actually purchased by real customers if they were registered to hit sales targets, and then parked the headline number that the entire world had been citing as proof of BYD's dominance was, at least partially, fiction. And it wasn't just the sales numbers that were falling apart. Quality recalls were accelerating at a rate that a company with BYD's stated momentum had no business experiencing. Net profit dropped 19% in 2025, not because revenue fell, but because the cost structure underneath the business was becoming impossible to sustain at the prices BYD had committed to. Then the early 2026 numbers arrived. Sales down 41% year-on-year. 41%. For a company that had built its entire story on relentless growth, that number was not a stumble, it was a signal. And the analysts who had been quietly watching all of this started using a word that made anyone familiar with recent Chinese financial history go cold. Evergrande. You remember Evergrande, the Chinese property giant that collapsed under $330 billion in debt, triggered a crisis that rippled through global markets, and left millions of unfinished apartments and unpaid suppliers in its wake. The parallels being drawn to BYD weren't casual. They were specific hidden debt, inflated output figures, supplier payment delays, state support masking, structural insolvency, the same architecture, a different industry. But here's what you need to understand. Whether BYD collapses or gets quietly bailed out by Beijing is almost beside the point now. Because BYD was never just a car company. It was a preview of something much larger, and the most alarming part of this entire story is still ahead of you. Beijing's real master plan. Here's what most people miss when they follow the BYD story. They get caught up in the question of whether BYD survives, whether the debt implodes, whether Beijing steps in, Whether the sales numbers recover, that's the wrong question. Because BYD was never the point. BYD was the proof of concept. Think about what Beijing learned from this operation. They took a domestic automaker, funded it past the point of profitability, weaponized its pricing against foreign competitors, captured market share across dozens of countries, and did it all while the target industries were still debating whether to take the threat seriously. And by the time the Western auto industry understood what had actually happened to it, 50,000 Volkswagen workers were clearing out their lockers, and Porsche was explaining to shareholders why 92% of their profits had vanished. That is an extraordinarily valuable lesson if you're the one who learned it. Now ask yourself this: what other industries is Beijing running this exact playbook on right now? Because the answer isn't a secret. It was published. China's 15th Five-Year Plan, the latest iteration of a coordinated national industrial strategy, explicitly identifies the sectors Beijing intends to dominate over the next decade: solar panels, semiconductors, shipbuilding, aerospace, battery storage, pharmaceuticals, steel. Each one targeted with the same framework: state subsidies to scale past profitability, pricing designed to undercut foreign competitors out of existence, and a timeline patient enough to outlast any Western electoral cycle. And this is where the story stops being about cars entirely. Western governments operate on 4-year cycles. Policies change with administrations. Industrial strategy gets caught between competing political priorities, lobbying pressures, and short-term budget constraints. Beijing operates on 5-year plans that stack into 15-year visions, that feed into 50-year national objectives. They are not playing the same game. They are not even playing on the same timescale. And while Western legislators were holding hearings about BYD's subsidies, writing reports, forming committees, debating tariff structures, Chinese state capital was already 3 moves ahead in industries that haven't made the news yet. But this was just the beginning of what you need to sit with. Look at solar panels. China now controls over 80% of global solar panel manufacturing. Not because Chinese companies simply out-innovated Western competitors, though some did, but because the same subsidy architecture that built BYD was deployed across the solar industry a decade earlier. Western solar manufacturers didn't lose a market competition. They were methodically priced out of existence while their governments were still writing clean energy incentive packages. The industry that the West needed most for its own energy transition is now almost entirely dependent on Chinese supply chains. Semiconductors are next. Shipbuilding is already largely done. And in each case, the mechanism is identical. State capital absorbs losses that no private company could sustain. Foreign competitors bleed out, and by the time the damage is visible, the supply chain dependency is already structural. Here's what makes this different from anything the Western world has faced before. Previous economic competitors, Japan, South Korea, Germany, were operating within the same basic framework. Market economies, rule of law, profit motive. You could compete with them because you were playing the same game. Beijing is running a state-directed resource allocation machine across the most critical industries of the next 50 years, and it published the schedule. The 15th Five-Year Plan is not a corporate strategy document. It is a national demolition order for Western industrial capacity, written in the language of development goals and innovation targets, but pointing in one direction: dominance, not market share. Not competitive advantage, dominance. The kind that, once achieved, is almost impossible to reverse, because the supply chains, the pricing power, and the manufacturing scale all reinforce each other. So no, BYD may or may not collapse. Beijing may bail it out quietly or let it restructure and emerge leaner. Either way, the damage to the Western auto industry is already done and mostly permanent. The real question you should be losing sleep over isn't whether BYD survives. It's which Western industry Beijing has already decided to dismantle next, and whether anyone in a position to stop it is paying close enough attention to notice before it's too late.